Having met Jesus, how now shall we live? So we're in the season of Lent. It began on Ash Wednesday earlier this week. There's some clues we are in a different season. If you're visiting this week, we don't always begin church this way. We have these purple vestments we are now wearing, freshly made by Evelyn, thank you, and donated by Yatunde, thank you. There's some other differences in the liturgy. There's a certain word we have put away for the season of Lent. And there's this time where we're invited into a deepening or a lengthening. Lent is an ancient word that means lengthen, and over the course of these 40 days, the days will get longer, the flowers will start to push their way up through the earth, and perhaps our faith will lengthen as well. This week or last week, as I rode my bicycle to work for the 8 a.m. service, it was the first time in a long time that it was light as I rode down, and that is always so welcome. It sort of feels like a mistake to be up and moving in the dark. The lectionary, the schedule of readings that we follow across the year, once we are into Lent, begins asking us these questions about, now that we've met Jesus, how shall we live? So on Thursday in chapel, we heard this famous scene in which Moses and the people of God are gathered on the border of the Holy Land. Moses has been leading the people for 40 years through the wilderness. This is the place that God has promised to them. They've endured so much and suffered so much, and now they're on this cusp of liberation. And the great tragedy of Moses' life is he's not going to live to see what God has promised to the people. He will die before they cross the Jordan. And he gives this last speech, speaking on God's behalf. He says to the people, "See, I've set before you life and death. I've set before you blessings and curses. Choose life." This is his entreaty. And something similar happens with Jesus today. Everything happens really fast in the Gospel of Mark. We think it is the first of the Gospels, the oldest of the Gospels, and Mark is in this excited hurry to tell us about Jesus, and as a consequence, details that show up in the other Gospels don't show up here. So in this one, Jesus gets baptized, he's pushed by the Spirit out into the wilderness, he's tempted, and then he is back, tempted by Satan. And then he is back. It isn't until we get to the Gospel of Luke that we get details about this temptation. The tempter says to Jesus, "How are you going to live?" The tempter says, "Well, why don't you're hungry, you've been out here a long time, why don't you turn these rocks into bread? I'm going to take you to the temple, why don't you jump off this balcony? God will save you, right, if you do that. Why don't you bow to me? Just a little, like even a nod would do, and I'm going to give you all sorts of power." So Moses says to the gathered people, "How shall you live? Here's some good ideas." The tempter says to Jesus, "How shall you live? Here's some bad ideas, although I'm going to dress them up as good ideas so you maybe can't tell. How shall you live?" And on its face, it seems like this question may be an obvious one and an easy one. "I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Which would you prefer?" Is this a question you need to consult your lawyer about, right? Would you prefer $100 or a kick in the pants? This is not a hard question. And so that sort of leaves us wondering, like, is Scripture kind of giving us sort of harmless and obvious advice today? Is this sort of like the after-school special? I don't know if any of you ever watched after-school specials, but often those specials, G.I. Joe was what I grew up watching, would end with kind of harmless advice. When you're brushing your teeth, turn off the tap because it's amazing how much water you'll save, right? That's good advice. I mean, you should do that, but it probably isn't going to transform the world or transform your life. Like that's, okay, excellent, agreed. Let's move on. It seems like this ought to be obvious, and yet we routinely choose curse over blessing. Or let me own this. I routinely choose curse over blessing. It's something that happens all the time in my life. A few examples. We choose curse over blessing when we prefer numbness over vitality. So there's a dark comic I came across, a comedian, and on the whole, I can't deal with his humor because what do they call like really dark comedy, like gallows humor? This is a guy who spends way too long on the gallows for my taste. But he said something that has stuck with me. It's a quip, but it's also true. He said, "There's no such thing as addiction. There's only things we prefer doing and enjoy doing more than being alive." And like, oh my God, that is right. If you look at the desperation on our streets, if you think about folks struggling with meth or fentanyl or old school smack or booze, this is very much a case of preferring things over being alive. But we don't need examples as extreme. I mean, those folks in many cases are beyond choosing, aren't they? I don't want to imply they're making a choice every day. This compulsive behavior that it continues despite destructive outcomes, sometimes it is well beyond a choice. But that shows up in smaller ways in all of our lives. It certainly shows up in mine. We prefer numbness over vitality when we avoid someone who's had a big loss or a big grief because, well, why don't we go visit someone who's in a big grief? Because we don't know what to say. What if I say the wrong thing when I'm in there? Or what if their grief and their loss is a comment on my mortality? I don't want to be reminded that I will die someday. I don't want to encounter the possibility that someone I love will die. We choose numbness over vitality when we go along to get along, when we avoid a necessary confrontation or fight with a family member, with a friend, even with someone in church, because it's easier or it feels easier not to have that conversation. We don't do the work of being vulnerable with another person and telling and hearing the truth. We choose numbness over vitality when we try to put away our own grief, our own sorrow, our own loss. We go home and numb it with muffins and beer and Netflix. Not that there's anything wrong with muffins, beer, and Netflix. I like all of those things. But it's a question of degree, right? There's a point where we're choosing these numbing activities instead of doing the work of grieving or of naming a struggle or of being fully alive. What if this Lent we said no to the temptation of numbness and said yes to vitality? We choose curse over blessing when we prefer comfort to the truth. So I heard a number of years ago, and so I'm quoting from some pretty distant memory here. I heard a radio interview with an ethicist, and her particular area of interest was helping folks, challenging folks to use morally accurate language to describe their actions, or maybe to borrow language from the 12-step tradition from Alcoholics Anonymous to use morally fearless language to talk about their actions, the choices they're making in their lives. And she told the story of interacting with a public school administrator, possibly a principal. The school had recently adopted a zero tolerance for violence policy. That sounds like a good thing. And one day the snows fell, and it turned out it was that kind of snow that was perfect for making snowballs. And so a child made a snowball and threw the snowball and struck another child. Well, that's all fine, except here at the school there is a zero tolerance for violence policy, and now the snowball thrower must be suspended. Never mind that the child who has been struck regards this as fine and innocent fun. The child who threw the snowball intended this as fine and innocent fun. Nobody's parents are upset. The administrator themselves views this as fine and innocent fun. But she says to the ethicist, I have no choice. We have a zero tolerance policy. I must suspend this student. And so the ethicist and the principal or administrator have a conversation, and the ethicist says, I wonder if that's true. And they talk for a while, and the principal concludes that a more morally accurate statement, a more morally fearless statement would be, I am choosing to suspend this child because if I do not, I will be reprimanded by my supervisors. But then she goes on to say, there's a pause, and then she goes on to say, but I don't like to think of it that way. And that's all of us, isn't it? How many things do we do? And then yeah, but I don't like to think of it that way. I don't like to think about where my phone was made. I find it convenient. I get to text my friends. There's games on it. It's a distraction when I'm waiting on the bus or waiting for some appointment. I don't like to think about the factory where it was produced. I don't like to think that how I choose to live might have anything to do with my neighbors living in destitution on the streets. I don't like to think that the convenience of air travel, and it's very convenient, I'll be flying to see my mother in not that long, might have anything to do with increasingly erratic weather. What if we used morally accurate language? How might we live differently? What if this Lent we said no to the temptation of comfort and chose the truth? One more. We choose curse over blessing when we prefer judgment to curiosity. So back in the heyday of the advice column, are there still advice columns? Okay, so a few folks are nodding. I was a big fan of Ann Landers in her time. She was in many ways ahead of her time, and always had this fun advice and often frequently sensible advice. There was a advice column that ran sometime in the 1970s, and it was a very worried mother who had written in about her adolescent daughter. She'd gone through her adolescent daughter's purse, and inside she had found birth control. And the question was, what should I do? And the reply from the advice column, well, I hope the first thing that the advice columnist said is stop going through your daughter's purse. That is actually the thing I would lead with, don't do that. But the core of the advice columnist's advice was get curious. Become curious rather than going straight to judgment. Gee whiz, that's hard, isn't it? Because judgment is seductive. There's this well-worn path. It feels good to sit in judgment of our neighbor. We all engage in these stories. They think they know everything. They never listen. They don't pay attention. They're angry all the time. These stories feel fair and liberating when we tell them about others. And I don't know if you've had stories like that told about you. I suspect you have. How often have they felt fair when someone has told a story like that about you? Very rarely, I suspect, has someone said, you think you know everything, and you've said, yes, that's right. I would agree with that. If Galileo and Marie Curie were to turn up, I could teach them some things, right? That seems unlikely, and yet we keep getting sucked into these stories. Jesus knows about this. There's that famous encounter, isn't there, where he meets a woman from the land of Cana, a Canaanite woman, and he's inherited from his culture. He's inherited judgment of folks like her. He knows that someone like a Canaanite woman is not fully human. Someone like a Canaanite woman does not deserve the love of God. And he speaks to her with contempt. She asks for help. She asks for food. And he says it's not fair to give the children's food and throw it to the dogs. It's a racial slur, right? And she beautifully challenges him and says, Lord, even the dogs eat the food that's fallen from the master's table. And in that instant, scales fall from Jesus' eyes, and he becomes curious instead of judgmental. He suddenly realizes the kingdom is way bigger than he thought. What would happen if we were to become curious in this incredibly polarized moment for us culturally and politically, in this moment of strange anger in our broader society? So many people are dysregulated. So many people are just on the verge of fury. For the first time in years, the other day, someone screamed at me while I was riding my bicycle, like screamed profanity at. That has not happened in a long time. I appreciate a sample size of one doesn't prove anything, but I noticed it, right? I noticed it because I haven't experienced that in a while, and like, oh, what kind of anger is just under the surface that screaming at a stranger seems proportionate? What would happen if we were to choose curiosity over judgment, even with those who don't feel like they are deserving of it? Here in Portland, people who it's hard to be curious about might include those folks wearing the red hats, right? What would happen if we dared to be curious about what is driving their perspective, what is driving their anguish, what is driving their anger? So 3 wonderings. We could do a lot more, but 3 wonderings about places in which we choose curse over blessing. What if this Lent we made a different choice? What if we chose vitality? What if we chose the truth? What if we chose, what was the third one that I set one against the other? Oh, I'm blank. Oh, thank goodness you're here. I'm so glad you're here. Yes, what if we chose curiosity? What if we chose, instead of the wide way that is open to us, the narrow way of Jesus? Now that we've met Jesus, how shall we live? See, I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life.